We're going to be looking at the revolutions following World War I. Make sure you're following up with Edmodo for your assignments. You're keeping up with my website, and also you're following YouTube for the lectures. There are three things we're going to talk about today. One, we're going to talk about the rise of communism in Russia. Two, we're going to talk about the rise of communism in China. And the third thing we're going to talk about is how nationalism increased in India and ultimately led to their independence. Let's start looking at Russia and their rise to communism. The history of Russia includes a long leadership of czars. Essentially, these are emperors. And these emperors had very oppressive rule in Russia. Tsar Alexander was the grandfather of Tsar Nicholas, and he was known to take political prisoners and imprison them in a place called Siberia, which is basically northern Russia, close to the Arctic Circle, and pretty much all that's there is tundra, rock, and just cold. One thing that's going to change the power of the czars is the Industrial Revolution. As the Industrial Revolution occurs, Russia becomes an industrialized nation and becomes one of the world's leading producers in steel. And because of that, the working class will increase. Well, as the working classes increase, they want to have new rights, and they want to have the opportunity to rule over the czars that have had this oppressive rule. So they're going to build up political parties, they're going to build up support amongst each other, and they're going to work to overthrow the czars. Eventually, a group called the Bolsheviks will be led by the name of Vladimir Lenin. And the Bolsheviks will have momentum, and Lenin will step in and gain power of the Bolsheviks and push that momentum. And at this point, they're a radical group, and people are very fearful of what they're doing, so fearful that Lenin himself decides to flee to Western Europe, fearing that he would be imprisoned to a place like Siberia. So he essentially leaves for his safety. Now, during World War I, Tsar Nicholas is not having much luck. He's looked at with little respect from his people. His people are starving in Russia. They're losing essentially millions of people in World War I, and he has little respect, and he's a poor leader at this time. During the war, thousands of workers will go to protest in front of the royal palace. And in what is known as Bloody Sunday, he will have Russian soldiers fire on the crowds and kill Russian citizens. And this is bad for the Tsar. And eventually, during World War I, Tsar Nicholas loses control and loses his power. A provisional government or a temporary government is put in place. And they will not last very long as Lenin returns to lead the Bolsheviks in the Bolshevik Revolution. And the Bolshevik Revolution, the Bolsheviks were encouraged by a writing by Karl Marx and Joseph Engel called the Communist Manifesto. And the Communist Manifesto is the precursor, the leading factor for communism. And so here the Bolsheviks chose the color of communism, red, against their nationalist enemy, who would be the White Army. So the Bolshevik Revolution becomes the Red Army versus the White Army, and that name, the Red Army, will stick as Russia remains to be communist for years to come. Now, that communism will eventually spread. Lenin and the Bolsheviks will win the Bolshevik Revolution. Lenin will restore order back to Russia. He'll get the government under control, and he'll get the economy under control, but it's a communist state, so the government controls virtually all aspects of the government and the economy. The Bolsheviks will change their name to the Communist Party. No longer will they be the Bolsheviks, they'll be the Communists. And Lenin will break the country up into what's called Soviets. And Soviets are self-governing republics under a central authority. This mostly occurred in western parts of Russia, or what we would call Eastern Europe. And that became later known as the Soviet blocs. Now he's going to rename it the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. And so this is how we get the term for the Soviet Union. As Lenin ages, he is going to be replaced, and there's two choices to replace him. Leon Trotsky, who led the Red Army during the Bolshevik Revolution, and a man by the name of Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin wasn't his real name. Stalin means man of steel, and he used that name to gain power, to gain respect and prestige from the workers, because it was a steel industry for Russia. The workers were the people making the steel. They were the one that needed new leadership. And so he takes over from Lenin and becomes a dictator that ruled a totalitarian state. And the totalitarian state had control over most all aspects of life: education, religion, and they indoctrinated many if not most of the citizens of Russia. And indoctrination means that they force them to believe and act in certain ways. Now, Stalin was very paranoid, and during his reign, he had what was called the Great Purge, which is where he removed communist leaders that he feared would oppose him. Communism also will spread in China. After the Treaty of Versailles, there is a movement in China to keep Western European influence out of Asia. And that leads to what's called the May 4th movement, in which there's a strong national movement occurring in China. To counter that, a man by the name of Mao Zedong, who has a very educated mind, he reads about Karl Marx and he learns about communism in Russia. He establishes the Chinese Communist Party and has ties to Lenin, who will provide supplies and help to Mao Zedong as the Chinese Communist Party grows. Mao Zedong will go up against Chiang Kai-shek, who will lead the nationalist forces against the communist forces in China. Chiang Kai-shek will eventually seize control of China and force the communists out. Now, Chiang Kai-shek seizes control with the help of Great Britain and France and other Western nations. But he's able to take control of the government, and he's able to force the communists out in a event called the Long March, in which the communists have to flee the pursuit of the nationalist army. A little bit later on, in a different segment, we'll talk about the advancing Communist Party in China. Finally, we're going to talk about Mohandas K. Gandhi in India and the movement for Indian independence. Now, during imperialism, Great Britain had great control over India. Indians were only allowed to buy goods from Great Britain, and then on top of that, they were taxed for those goods as well. So after World War I, India really increases the nationalist attitudes because there was an opportunity for them to become independent, and Great Britain denied them of that. Now, a massacre happens in India from British soldiers, and a man by the name of Mohandas Gandhi will emerge as a new leader from that massacre, trying to promote new tactics to fight this group that did not give the Indians what they were searching for. And that tactic was called civil disobedience. And civil disobedience is the deliberate public refusal to obey an unjust law, and it's usually associated with nonviolence. In the United States, we most closely associate civil disobedience and nonviolent protest with that of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. King and other followers of the Civil Rights Movement learned a lot from Gandhi and the Indian people and how they were able to take a greater force in Great Britain and have a fair waged fight against them using these tactics. The most famous is called the Salt March. And the Salt March was a combination of a boycott and demonstration. Here, thousands of Indians marched to the sea to make their own salt in protest of the British overcharging and overtaxing to buy salt from them. And so this was an example of nonviolent movement in which they refused to buy the salt, went to the sea, made salt on their own, and demonstrated that they were willing to do what it took to get what they needed. And it's because of those actions that eventually India will gain a limited self-rule and eventually independence. That concludes our notes for today. Please make sure you're keeping up with your Edmodo accounts for assignments. Make sure you're keeping up my website, and also make sure that you're keeping up with YouTube for any new lectures.